Hi class, welcome to History 201, Unit 8.1. This is a section from Chapter 9, which you are not required to do the reading, but the information you need to extract from this presentation I will give you in the presentation and also try to make it clear at major points what I'm trying to get across. This will be on the quiz and on the exam. So there we go. So this chapter starts the final third of our course where we're going to look at the period of 1820 to 1860. That's when the Civil War starts, that 40-year period. We're going to look at it three different ways. Economic change and reform, which is Unit 8, slavery, which would be a future unit, and also the collapse of the United States during this period. So get ready for that. So just as a reminder, it'll be for three units, we'll look at the same period of time, but in three different ways. So this is a quick one. This is Unit 8.1, and we won't go as deep as we do in most of the chapters. Just need you to get the main ideas straight in your head. So, there'll be a dozen or more ideas you need to figure out, and here we go. So the first possible question, this will not be a written answer question, this presentation, although you could use it in a written answer, but it won't be a focus of one. So one of the potential objective questions that could show up is, I want you to understand what came together in 1820 to 1860 for a dramatic economic growth for the United States of America and other places as well, of course. The first is, you should understand that when I usually ask this question, I get two answers. There's lots of natural resources and there was a lot of immigration, and these two things together helped create the United States of America to be a strong economy. And that's true. So out of these first three, natural resources and immigration, the most common answer, that is definitely a fact. If the United States was located where Paraguay is, I studied Paraguay for a living, it wouldn't have been able to develop economically the way it has. If it didn't have the immigration, just like Paraguay itself also didn't have, likewise, the growth would have been more limited. So immigrants in this time period equal economic growth and a healthy economy. Also, the top bullet point, you should remember that in the Atlantic world, so Europe and the Americas, and to some extent Western Africa, there was economic growth as well. So the United States is participating in an industrialization process in Europe that is interacting with the Americas, North and South America, and Africa, and to some extent Asia, though the cost of shipping are starting to become greater when you go that far away. But in the Atlantic world especially, trade is beginning to increase as the Americas can provide more raw materials, cheaper foods to Europe that in some ways is industrializing, not everywhere the same. So this period of industrialization in Europe and to some extent the United States then is all feeding off each other. So the Atlantic world context helps. Again, if you're the island of Fiji, you can't take part in the Atlantic world context as well. So your ability to grow dramatically economically would not be as strong as if you are, let's say, in Cuba, which there's a better chance you could, and they did. Now, in the United States, looking back in the United States, in addition to natural resources and immigration, another element that comes together to create this expansion, this economic expansion, is there is a transportation revolution. And transportation revolution, although sounding kind of boring maybe to you, roads, canals, railroads, one thing it does do is it drives down the cost of production, because now goods can be brought to market cheaply, so the cost of transporting them goes down. And what this does is it allows areas that were not able to produce goods for the market, let's say along up in the north of upstate New York, when a canal comes through, they can now produce goods for market. So that allows for economic growth. And they can also consume products more cheaply because products get to them more cheaply with the lowered transportation cost. So it starts to accelerate what can be produced and brought to market, and also goods on market that can be consumed. They're all becoming cheaper. Another element that came together for the United States to grow economically and begin we call it a mechanization process more than industrialization, but it's a little bit of both. Is that there was capital. There was capital in the United States, money that could be used by wealthy families to invest. If you are in a location like Paraguay that does not have much capital in 1820, then you're going to have a harder time growing economically towards mechanization and industrialization. But the United States did have this capital. An interesting one that most people wouldn't suspect is the U.S. state and local governments were all in on this expansion. They participated by supporting it. So when I was growing up in 1980, and the Reagan Revolution was happening in politics, there was a big idea going around that we all told each other that back in the old days, the United States economy grew because there was a small government, and government is inefficient and gets in the way of business. And then since, 1930 and the New Deal, government has grown larger and larger and is making capitalism less efficient. Well, that might be true. This is not an economics class, or at least parts of it are true. It's not a good version of history. It's not historically accurate, because in this time period of 1820 to 1860, governments are very actively involved in supporting business and working with business. So, so you put all these things together and they start reinforcing each other. And what you get is a process of mechanization or industrialization or economic growth, or all three of these are fine words to use. And it takes, a combination of all of these bullet points to make that happen. And the United States is fortunate enough, if a growing economy is good, then they're fortunate to have all of these and be able to participate in the Atlantic world growth towards industrialism. Okay, so that's the first main point, is understanding how all of these elements came together and were, parts of the recipe that allowed the mechanization, industrialization, economic growth to occur. The next slides will just be kind of visual references to what I just said. Here's a map, for example, of canals that were created. And if you look at towards the top of the map where the red lines are, you can see that in New York, the Erie Canal is connecting the Hudson River, which is above New York City and has been an area of trade with the Iroquois all this time. They connect it to the Great Lakes. So this connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Great Lakes. And then if you look over to the left towards what's Michigan, but it's really Ohio, Toledo, you can see they connected from Cleveland and Toledo, they connected to the Ohio River, which is down lower. And this connects the Ohio River Valley with the Great Lakes, with the Atlantic. And so all of these canals reduce the cost. By the way, just for fun's sake, you can see in the middle there is a Portage Railroad, which is, a Cumberland. Sorry about that. My glasses are a little off on that. The National Road was built from Maryland to St. Louis. And that's not a canal, but that's a road, is what I wanted to point out. So these canals and these roads, again, lowered the cost. And the Erie Canal is one of the more famous ones, which connects Albany to Buffalo, so the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. And as mentioned, railroads were also developed during this time period, more in the latter half, as you can see. And you don't need to memorize this graph, but just notice that the growth was pretty significant. And all of this, canals, roads, and railroads, are reducing cost, which, as I mentioned, allows more goods to come to market because areas that could not produce goods to provide market because it was too expensive to transport them now could. So more product and cheaper product because it's being transported more cheaply. And then back towards them, they are able to purchase goods more cheaply. So it's going to move the United States farmers, not all at once, but along a spectrum, to becoming less and less self-reliant farmers and start participating in the market. A couple other maps just to show you. If you look at the two colors of orange and red, that's how long it took newspapers to travel in 5 days. In orange, at the beginning of our time period, but by the end, you can see it can get further. In 10 days, it could go to the yellow at the beginning of our time period, but towards the end of our time period, it can make it, all the way down almost to St. Louis. So this shows us that the speed of which products could travel was in fact accelerating. Another outcome of this, we can look at the size of cities and where they are. Notice New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore being the largest, New York, did I say New York? New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore being the largest cities, with Boston and New Orleans taking up the next size. We look at St. Louis and Louisville and Cincinnati. They're quite small. But by the end of our time period, notice how this has changed. New York, Philadelphia, and New York, because it adds Brooklyn and Newark and these others. That's where the dramatic growth is in the size of the city. But notice that in addition to cities getting bigger, that they're starting to move along a trajectory towards the west of Philadelphia. So Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Louis, Louisville, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Buffalo. Yep, there's a lot of NFL teams in that group, isn't there? That is where the growth is occurring. Well, if you notice in the South, Richmond, Charleston, Montgomery, their cities are not developing as quickly. So you can see that this is becoming a northern experience more than it is a southern experience. We're going to go over the South in a future unit. Just one more graph on this process. You can see on the left the population per square mile, and by 1860 you can see how much that has grown in the North and South, right? So the South does move people west, but they're not in cities. And in fact, a lot of them will be, yeoman farmers, and a lot of them will be plantations with slaves. And so we'll go over that on a different unit. Okay, so that's kind of the first little bit, the recipe for change and some kind of visuals of how it's moving populations into cities. So cities are getting bigger, and there are more of them. But again, they're also more in the north than they are in the south. No need to kind of memorize this. I just want to point out that bit by bit, more and more family farms. Remember Jefferson's agrarian republic? He saw a country full of farming families who owned their own land and participated with virtue in republican politics. These groups, and there's more in the north than the south, but there are in the south as well, they begin to participate in commercial farming. So instead of just producing mostly for their own needs, they begin accessing credit and producing goods to sell to the market. Okay, so that's one thing. Another development you may have learned in a different place as well is, so in the cities, we begin to see the creation of manufactories, such as the textile factories in the Northeast. And the important thing to see here is that instead of producing in homes, instead of spinning and weaving their own cloth and then selling it or using it, now lots of women, single young women mostly, will move to a factory city and start laboring there. Why do they go there? Well, they're following the work The work is now going to take place in a single building, and these young women want to have their independence. They want to earn some money so they can get ahead. They didn't plan on working there their whole lives, but they thought, and you might find some single young men and women like this today. I'm going to graduate from college. I'm going to get a job. I'm going to work 5 to 10 years. I'm going to, get an apartment or a house. I'll get set up, and maybe I might get married if I want at that time. And these women were very much like that. So earning money would make for a more stable future family for them, and that's what they were mostly seeking. Okay, so manufactured products in this new economy that's growing for these 40 years. Just want to remind you that before the process, that in towns, artisans were making and selling a lot of these goods. Again, iron goods, blacksmith, silversmith, cabinet makers, gun makers, candle makers. And in the countryside, there was a system by which someone who was trying to sell clothing or cloth, for example, would go around collecting it from all the rural households. And that was okay, but it wasn't as efficient as now manufactories will start to emerge, because they centralize where things are being produced. And so by doing that, they drive down the cost to produce by putting it all in one location. So that's the key thing, is that as this switch comes towards manufactories, now again, not all Americans go from being farmers to being workers in a manufactory, right? It's a process, but it is a process that more and more Americans are becoming involved in over these 40 years. And it's just getting going. It's nothing like the world today where, the majority of Americans live in cities. It's just a small process at this time, but it's going in that direction. Nothing really I want you to take from this other than to notice that on the right there's a timetable for the mills. And so the workers' lives who are working in the mills, they're changing. They used to work in the countryside, and there was a rhythm of the countryside. Get up with before the sun. When do you take your food? Longer days in the summer, shorter days of work in the winter. Do your farming in the summer. Maybe in the winter you start mending fences or the barn door. So there was a rhythm to rural life. But when you worked in a manufactory, kind of like showing up at 8 or 9 a.m. for History 201 in fall 2022, the time is the time. So it was altering people's lives and how they live those lives, and becoming regimented by the clock. And also, the owner of the manufactory is the one who set the rules, and as a worker, you had to comply with them or else. So again, this would be a visual where the women and eventually men in the textile mill of Lowell, what their daily life was like. It changed from their farm life, and that's the key point I'm trying to get across. So here's just a map to show you in 1810 textile manufactories. There are a few in New England and New York, but you can see that the number grows and grows and grows. So when we are starting to look at cities like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and Cleveland, what begins to happen is this. In the morning there is going to work right from your home. If they were yeoman farming families, they just walked out their door and they would be working, or they might even be working in their house, and it would be part of the farm jobs they needed to do. But now you move to a factory city, you live in urban housing, you go to work, you clock in, you do your repeated task all day, you go back home, you work for wages instead of course, farmers are producing their wealth on the farm. So it's a different life. And so when we look at Ohio and Cincinnati, and similar places, this is what's going on. And so again, I'm just imprinting to you that it's changing people's lives and the rhythm of their lives, because that's going to come up later in Unit 8. It will make sense. Okay, legally, some things you probably haven't thought too much about is we said government supported the growth of capitalism, and so did the court system. Because prior to this time period, in a way you wouldn't be as familiar with today, your individual rights versus the rights of the community for your property, they were more in balance. They were not completely, your own choice. And we still have that a little bit today in modern America. If Kaiser Aluminum here in Spokane wanted to run their factory however they wanted and they dumped poison into the Spokane River, today they would get in trouble for that. They can't do whatever they want on their property. There are some social consequences for the group that need to be taken in account. And so back then, that was more of a thing. How society would be affected by your individual rights was, I'm going to say balanced, but again, taken into account. But that changes with this move towards mechanization and industrialization. And so corporations are being created, right, which are legal entities, but they aren't people. And so these corporations provide advantages because what happens is your families can invest money into a corporation and be part of it if you're wealthy. But when the corporation fails or is liable, the people's personal wealth is not at risk, only the wealth they put into the company. And so it starts limiting the liability that wealthy families have by participating in this. And so this makes it less risky. And with less risk is economic growth, generally speaking. Also, the court systems started finding that contracts were binding. Right? You could make a contract at a given time, like before COVID or something like that, where you think something's going to happen, but then COVID or something catastrophic changes the reality. Is that contract still valid because now the situation has changed? Well, this time period began to make contracts more binding. And by so doing, again, it reduces the risks for corporations and businesses, because if they make a deal, they know it's going to be followed through. And so this all helps the growth of business and the economy at this time. There you go. By the way, those contracts, if they should be binding or not, a recent one when you were very young was that Hollywood writers in Hollywood for TV especially had a contract, and they made $200,000 or more. That it's a lucrative job, and they're in a union, and they had agreements with the studios, right? But then the internet came along, which at that time in the early 2000s allowed for things to be streamed in ways they had never been streamed before, and that provided more revenue streams for the businesses. And the writers, were trying to change their contract because, the fundamentals of how money was gained from television radically changed, and the studios are like, well, it's not our fault. You signed the contract. And the writers are like, yes, we did, assuming that these certain business models were going forward, but now they've radically changed in a way no one could have foreseen, so we should revisit it. So that was a famous case when you were youngins back in the early 2000s. So anyway, back in 1820 to 1860, the creation of corporations can run the way they run, and the fact that contracts were protected more, this allowed for lower risk, which allowed for the economy to grow as well. So we're starting to see in the factory cities, but not all across the United States, because of course a lot of it is still farming families, right? But you're starting to see the owners of property running the factory doing well economically. There are some skilled laborers, a lot of unskilled labor, both men, women, and children, participating in. So this is turning. So the guy on the right, let's say he's an artisan who makes what they call then tollware. You can see it's pretty fancy eating ware, right? Well, if a factory shows up and can make those goods much cheaper than he can, then he'll eventually have to join the factory as a laborer. And so he'll become a member of the working class, which the fancy scholarly word is a member of the proletariat. That's a word Marx uses that we still use today. And so he's moving from owning his own shop and tools and being an independent worker. Instead, he becomes a worker who sells his labor for wages, and he no longer owns the factory, right? The factory's owned by someone else. It's not his shop, it's someone else's factory. So his life changes in many ways, as does control over his day. Before, he could do work as little or as much as he wanted, and when he wanted, right? But that's no longer possible under a factory. So again, showing you that people's lives, daily lives, weekly lives, monthly and yearly lives are all changing. As mentioned, there's an urbanization process at the beginning of the chapter. About 9% of the United States live in what the book calls urban locations, and by 1860 that's 20%. And if you just look at the Northeast in New England, it's about 35%. So over 1 out of 3 people now live in cities. And a lot of the increase of moving from 9 to 20% geographically is occurring from Pittsburgh towards the west. We'll skip Marx's idea. Just know that as these cities started becoming the tall, cramped places they were, many cities started to think ahead to create public space for all those urban people to, participate in. So places like Central Park, Hyde Park in London, these types of public spaces were brought into the urban planning. Also, neighborhoods in cities began to be organized by class. So there were parts of town where housing was cheaper and rent was cheaper, and the housing was less quality and more densely packed. And then there would be, of course, neighborhoods that were more wealthy, had more space, perhaps individual houses instead of apartments. And, the material conditions in these cities were, by our standards today, quite lacking. They would be full of repetitive diseases that are caused in many regards by all the humans and other animals living in close quarters. So disease could be spread easily, and especially through the sewage, human sewage and animal sewage that might be open. Okay, just kind of finishing up this little quick version of 8.1 then. There is a wealthy class that's moving from being merchants and financiers towards producing goods, although the trade and old jobs the wealthy class were doing still remain. Of course, we're not talking about southern large plantation owners yet, but they would be kind of paralleling this. And then the middle class does, for academics, for historians, doesn't really exist until now. The middle class is a very specific term we use, that as economies industrialize, then there is this dramatic growth of a white-collar job that did not exist before. And these are managers, right? People with MBAs today, right? Managers of the manufactories, people who are usually college educated or their version of it back then. They are literate. They are good bookkeepers, so accounting, lawyering, administrating, these types of jobs would be skilled, right? So they have skills that they can leverage on the market for greater pay. And this middle class is pretty small in this time period, but it is growing, and it will definitely develop a very specific ideology, which is still with a lot of us in the United States today. And then the working class that's starting to develop, the proletariat, right? They're also going to start to have ideas about these developments and what might be wrong with them, right? They might even start to call wage, being a member of the proletariat, wage slavery, right? Which is American trigger word for slavery is bad, right? It's tyranny. It's the opposite of freedom. So they start to conclude maybe that this capitalist system is enslaving them as the working class. So keep your eye on that. Also, what you'll find is in these cities, there are increased tensions for these jobs. And race is one, but not the only factor that would lead to conflict. In Philadelphia, for example, in 34, 38, and 42, there are three very distinct urban disturbances, riots, and they are all targeted either to the Philadelphia Free African Americans, which you've come to know from the Absalom Jones reading and Richard Allen, or abolitionists. In 1838, it was against black and white abolitionists, and they burned down the building. So Philadelphia became, it was before, but it continued to be a hotbed for abolitionism. And a lot of them, of course, were African American. So the 1842 riot, I'm adding this for you folks because now you're starting to get to know it. That building to the left in the background at 6th and Lombard is the AME church that Jones and Allen helped come to fruition, right? And this, ironically, is the location where the 1842, I've got that wrong on the bottom, and I'll change that for future generations. The 1842 location is right there in front of the church, where the African Americans were attacked mostly by Irish working class immigrants, Catholic Irish, over employment, although that wasn't always the reason the attacks happened. This attack happened because African Americans were parading, celebrating the abolition of slavery in Jamaica. The one in 1834 started over a fight over a merry-go-round horse. That's a true story. All right. So now, again, if you go to Philadelphia, I hope you'll give this little spot a whirl. And now you know two interesting events that happened right here on this spot. So race and gender as a role in how this economic growth went forward. Certainly, just so you know, John Jacob Astor provides the quintessential famous rags to riches story. By 1848, he made it. You can all make it. Well, slaves, of course, are not going to be able to participate in the economic growth other than as slaves. So that's not a fair comparison to John Jacob Astor. They can't do it. Free blacks, about 2% of the population, they could succeed to many levels. Could be doctors and other service industries. But the majority who serviced the African American population, by the way, typically not the white population. And they found opportunity lacking. So resources for education and gaining skills were more difficult for them to access, right? And that's something to keep an eye out. If we're looking at, as scholars, abilities of groups of Americans to equally participate in the United States, one argument would be that if a certain group does not have similar access to public resources, then the outcomes that are possible for them can be thwarted in one direction, right, or another. So, and that's why free African Americans are forming societies like the AME Church to try and create institutions that can help with education and other means to better employment. By the way, African free blacks cannot participate in the growth in the countryside moving west and getting farms. They are excluded from that process. And one final little teensy bit to keep your eye on is one of the middle class's ideas that became an ideology was that the ideal woman would not go to the factory to work, but would rather stay at home. Now, notice the middle class can say this because the middle class wage earner, if it's a man, which mostly it was, he earns more than the working class. And so they can afford to only have one of them working. And so this idea that home is kind of opposite of work, and an ideal of a real woman would stay home and kind of protect the family from the evils of the hard world outside, and that work, she's not working because she's at home. The guy who leaves the house is working. So the idea that work is earning income, all these ideas are starting to be developed by the middle class. And again, you might notice how long-lived these can be. If, for example, my wife Christine, if she didn't leave the house for wages and she's raising our 4 kids, and someone says, "Do you work?" She'd say, "Well, no, I this, and the other." But that's the definition of work as being laid out as leaving the home for wages. So anyway, something to kind of think about. So what we find is that, again, overall, these artisans, such as a woodworker, would start to lose their percentage of the economy and begin to become, wage laborers in factories, and factories are starting to grow, and grow, right? This idea, again, of the middle class, that a real woman should stay at home, this idea that a working woman is subverting the natural order of the family would also be brought to attention, which is interesting because the rural classes where the whole family is on the farm, they all worked, right? They all worked. Everyone worked all day. It didn't matter if you're a male, female, young, old, you worked. So this is something that's new, this middle class urban definition of work. And finally, what you do begin to see is the beginnings of labor organization, 10, 20 years into this process. And unions will be made legal by the courts. They weren't in Britain at this time, and or at least not as protected. We'll call it that difference. And again, so Americans who use liberty and slavery as their understandings, you do begin to see the beginnings of some Americans, working class Americans, referring to the free market wage system as wage slavery. And so you do see here and there these new proletariat trying to negotiate with the factory owners for better conditions, hours, and the right to organize, and wages too. And they thought that was their right as Americans, that they should not be victims of another person's increased leverage over them because the other person owned the factory and the workers didn't. So it's an interesting case. So overall, that's 8.1. We have seen the ingredients that came together to make the economic growth, the mechanization and industrialization. We've looked at some maps, and we've gone into the process, and again have highlighted how it began to change many, many people's lives, even many of the farmers in the North who are beginning to participate in commercial farming. And the next topic will be the Reform era, and we will go over first the small reforms, small in scope, and then we will look at larger reforms such as abolitionism and women's rights or feminism. All right, bye guys.